If you ever went to college here in the West, I'm sure you've heard at least one of your professors say that private property should be completely abolished, that getting rid of it would be an important key to solving human suffering. But given the words of the 8th commandment, I wonder if that's the way God thinks about it. In recent years, there's been a lot of buzz, especially on social media and conspiracy websites, about an article published by the World Economic Forum. It was written by a Danish politician named Ida Auken, and while most people have never actually read her article, most of us have heard about its most famous line, the one where she pitches her utopian vision of the future and says, "You will own nothing, and you'll be happy." Actually, that's not quite what she said. The famous quote was created from the title of an essay she wrote back in 2016 called "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." A title that is sure to raise more than a few eyebrows. But by the time it arrived on the official website of the World Economic Forum, the title had been changed to "Here's How Life Could Change in My City by the Year 2030. So let me read you a little bit from that article to look at what the fuss is all about, and then we'll ask ourselves why this made so many people so very angry. So here we go. She writes, "Welcome to the year 2030. Welcome to my city," or should I say, our city. I don't own anything. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I don't own any appliances or any clothes. It might seem odd to you, but it makes perfect sense for us in this city. Everything you considered a product has now become a service. We have access to transportation, accommodation, food, and all the things we need in our daily lives. One by one, all these things became free. So it ended up not making sense for us to own much. Now, I have to think that some people would think that sounds kind of like paradise. I mean, who wouldn't want to stop worrying? Just try to imagine a world where your needs are always met and you can spend your one and only lifetime doing really fulfilling things, the stuff that actually makes you happy. Of course, utopia doesn't exist, and it never has, outside the gates of Eden. And human history is frequently punctuated with the ruins of utopian experiments gone horribly wrong, which is why most people reject this idea. We've seen this kind of talk before, and it always seems to end in violence and heartache. But just for the sake of argument, let's pretend that this is actually possible. She continues, "First, communication became digitized and free to everyone. Then when clean energy became free, things started to move quickly. Transportation dropped dramatically in price." And then we come to this part, just a couple of paragraphs later. Listen to this. "In our city, we don't pay any rent because someone else is using our free space whenever we do not need it. My living room is used for business meetings when I'm not there." Now, I've got to say, that part doesn't really sound like utopia, at least not to me. I mean, think about this. What if there's a scheduling conflict or that meeting runs long? Where are you supposed to go? Stand outside your own home? The author assumes that people aren't naturally selfish, that they're going to share things perfectly. And you and I know better than that. She also says that products will become services, so people will always manufacture very high quality things. Why? Well, because planned obsolescence in her utopia doesn't make sense anymore. Not if you get rid of the profit motive. Just make stuff that will last forever, and the whole community will share it. If you want to cook something, just put in your order, and the specialized cooking equipment comes right to your door free of charge, and you can just use it. But of course, what she doesn't explain is what happens when scarcity kicks in, when all of us want the same piece of equipment at the same time. For example, what if almost everybody wants a deep fryer to cook their Thanksgiving turkey? She's pretending scarcity doesn't exist. And let's be honest, are human beings really going to become less selfish, less competitive? I mean, it's not as if we haven't tried this kind of thing before. We had more than 70 years of centralized economic control in the Soviet Union. You know, from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. It's Karl Marx 101. Back in those days, the economy was carefully planned every 5 years, and people were assigned their role in society based on the whims of high-ranking party members, who, of course, always put the people's interests ahead of their own, right? Soviet communism was the world's biggest social engineering experiment, and it failed to fix our biggest human problem, which, from the Bible's perspective, is our fallen nature. The Soviets intended to demonstrate that if we all just shared the means of production, if we owned everything in common, well, then we would finally achieve real equity, which is not the same as equality. Equality makes us all equal before the law, but equity tries to force equal economic outcomes for everybody, giving everybody exactly the same stuff. And we have never achieved that, and I don't think we will. I mean, Jesus himself pointed out that you always have the poor with you in Matthew chapter 26. What happened in the Soviet Union was essentially the opposite of what the government promised. Party elites enjoyed a very comfortable life, but the rank-and-file citizens somehow ended up even more poor than they were before. If you're my age or older, you remember the pictures of bread lines and empty store shelves. And of course, Marxism also produced a very serious problem when it came to the value of individual human beings. To put it bluntly, there was no room for individuals in that system. There was only the collective or the state. The individual was nothing more than a means to an end, a cog in the state machinery. And if your personal beliefs stood in the way of the will of the state, well, in that case, you were off to the gulags. And the author of this article was honest enough to point this out as she described her utopian daydream. Here, just listen to this part. She says, "Once in a while I get annoyed about the fact that I have no real privacy, nowhere I can go and not be registered. I know that somewhere everything I do, think, and dream of is recorded. I just hope that nobody will use it against me." If you're going to engineer the lives of millions or billions of people, you're going to have to monitor just about everybody for antisocial behavior. You have to get rid of the kinds of people who might jeopardize this dream of perfect worldwide cooperation. If you're going to make it work or look like it's working, you're going to have to police every single corner of every single life. And to really make sure it's working, you're going to have to incentivize tattling on your neighbors, just like we saw in the former Soviet Union. I mean, you really can't have all those pesky religious people prioritizing the scriptures over the word of the state. So again, off to the gulags with those people. To this day, there are Eastern Bloc Christian churches that move very slowly before they let newcomers join the congregation because, well, back in the day, they could never be sure if those new people were actually spies, KGB. Which brings me to the 8th commandment, the one that deals with stealing. And of course, you might be wondering why I'm connecting that to a controversial article from the World Economic Forum. It's because a lot of people took that article very seriously, and it was trending on social media for a really long time. And most people recognize that Ms. Auken's daydreams are actually dangerous because they run contrary to human nature. The last time somebody tried something like this on a large scale, the price tag was about 100 million people murdered on the altar of global communism. And in light of the 10 Commandments, I want to drill down just a little bit deeper and ask if the real problem in this world is the existence of private property. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Back in the early days of the Enlightenment, there was an influential thinker who had a big problem with the whole concept of private property. Now, you might not think of this guy as being one of the most influential thinkers of all time because he doesn't always make headlines, but I assure you, this guy's influence runs deeper than some people think. In fact, even Karl Marx, the granddaddy of communism, was heavily influenced by this guy's writings, and we can lay a lot of the blame for the murderous French Revolution at his feet as well. His name was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and when it comes to the matter of ethics, well, let's just say, he didn't have any. Not only did he refuse to marry his longtime girlfriend, but he also cheated on her and then he justified it. And then when he got her pregnant, he dropped the child off at an orphanage because, well, he was just too busy and far too important to raise a baby. And if that wasn't bad enough, he actually did that 5 times. He dropped off 5 babies at the orphanage and made them wards of the state. And this was supposed to be one of the most important philosophers of all time. To Rousseau's way of thinking, children actually belong to the state more than they belong to their parents. So of course he was a big fan of Plato, who said something similar about the role of children in his famous book, Republic. Here's what he said in Book 5 of the Republic. "The wives of our guardians are to be common, and their children are to be common, and no parent is to know his own child, nor any child his parent." So, in other words, Plato taught that children actually belong to the community, and the whole reason you have children is to provide workers for the state. Sound familiar? Of course, Plato was theorizing, and he waffles a little bit on how practical this idea really was, but still, to Plato, the state was the primary entity in this world, and you and I are born to serve that state. So, later on, in the 18th century, we get Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who recognizes that the world is broken and painful, like we all do. And he suggested something similar to Plato. In this popular book, Emile, he uses Plato as a foundation for a new model of public education. Here's what he wrote. "Do you want to get an idea of public education? Read Plato's Republic. It is the most beautiful educational treatise ever written." Again, he's saying that the purpose of children is to support the state, and they don't actually belong to you. In fact, he said your children belong to everybody. So then Rousseau gets really excited about this ancient story that came from the city of Sparta, where a messenger went to the home of a mother and said, "Hey, unfortunately, your 5 sons were just killed in battle." And she rebuked him. "That's not what I want to know," she said. So the messenger added, "Well, we did win the victory." The point is, she was more concerned about the success of the state than the lives of her sons. And this is how Rousseau ends that story. He says, "The mother runs to the temple and gives thanks to the gods. This is the female citizen." Rousseau's excited because here's a woman who is thankful that her boys died serving the state. Why? Well, because again, Rousseau believed that your children actually belong to the state. And sadly, I still hear a lot of people try to bring that perspective to the subject of public education. I mean, I hear it all the time. Your children belong to everybody. And that's really one of the most horrific aspects of Rousseau's philosophy, the idea that people should be subservient to the will of the state instead of the state being subservient to its citizens. He actually taught that the will of the state is its own entity. Somehow, the collective will of the people generates a single identifiable will of the government, as if the government is a person. And Rousseau taught that the will of the state is more important than you. Now, from that perspective, he really attacked the idea of personal private property. Rousseau ended up being a key source for Karl Marx, who taught that the state should own all the means of production, and everybody should hold the means of production in common. Private property, he said, should be completely abolished. Now, you'd think that after the 20th century, we'd be done with that kind of thinking because in hindsight, we can see that that led to an absolute humanitarian disaster. And yet, for some strange reason, those ideas are still in circulation. In fact, we continue to teach them in our colleges. The real problem with humanity, we're told, is private property. And it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who gave us that idea in the first place. Ban private property, he said, and you'll solve the problems of injustice and inequality. Here's what he wrote. The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow man, "Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth to no one." Now, of course, on the surface, that almost sounds biblical. I mean, doesn't God actually own everything anyway? Well, the answer to that is yes. "If I were hungry," God says, "I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine." So, on one level, Rousseau's not entirely wrong. But honestly, the last time that all human beings had equal access to absolutely everything was in the Garden of Eden. You know, before sin. After the fall, God told Adam that you and I now have to earn our living by the sweat of our brow. We were supposed to be the stewards of creation, but instead we gave the keys to God's number one enemy, and now we have to live by the serpent's rules. Now, the Bible doesn't promote the idea that it's now everybody only looking out for themselves. God does still expect us to watch out for the welfare of our neighbors. In fact, if you read Matthew chapter 25, you'll notice that Jesus is very hard on people who don't help the needy. He calls them goats, and they just don't go to heaven. And back in the Old Testament, God told His people to leave some of the harvest on the edge of the field so the poor could come and glean it. You might remember that from the story of Ruth who gleaned the field of Boaz. So yes, God expects us to look out for each other. But at the same time, does the Bible identify the real problem as private property? Absolutely not. In fact, the Bible recognizes the value of boundaries. Boundaries became an all-important necessity in a world that's populated by sinners. The eighth commandment forbids you to take somebody else's property. And what is private property? Well, the moment you take something from nature and add your own labor to it, it kind of becomes a part of you. You take a form of ownership. So, for example, if you go out into the field and collect 5 buckets of wild blackberries, do I have the right to take half of those buckets without your permission? I mean, God actually grew those berries, right? And He actually owns everything, so don't those berries belong to all of us? Well, yes and no. Because you and I both know that something happens when you add your work to those wild berries. I no longer have the right to take them because that wouldn't just be stealing your berries, that would also be stealing your labor. And that's what's at the heart of the eighth commandment, which says point blank, "You shall not steal." If the world was perfect and sinless, I wouldn't even dream of taking your berries, I'd just go and get my own. But in a fallen world, in a place where human beings are selfish, well, we're going to need some hard and fast guidelines if we don't want to fall into anarchy. And speaking of guidelines, the clock in the studio here tells me that I'm on the verge of violating one of those, and so as soon as we take a really quick break, I'll be right back.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
I know for some people, the abolition of private property sounds kind of nice. But honestly, that's only because it's an idea that completely overlooks the real problem that you and I have. According to the Bible, we are broken. We're sinful. Instead of living for the glory of God, we now live for self. And it's that selfish tendency, that sinful impulse that causes all the trouble. You can engineer civilization all you want, but at the end of the day, if you don't solve the sin problem, that engineering's never going to work. That's the reason the Soviet experiment ultimately imploded. It was a system run by sinners. Take away somebody's incentive to work and force them into a life they don't want, and you get workers who stop caring. In fact, some of them started consuming copious amounts of vodka instead of actually doing their jobs. And somehow, the people at the top of the social hierarchy still lived like kings, while the rest of the people lived in abject poverty. Going back to that article from the World Economic Forum, the basic problem with owning nothing is that it's never going to make you happy, not when you're wired to live for self. The big mistake that Rousseau made was assuming that people are essentially good, that if we could just fix the institutions that people have to live under, that would fix all the problems. It's a philosophy that insists that people aren't the problem, the system is the problem. Back in 1762, the Academy of Dijon in France sponsored an essay contest that raised a really important question. Has the restoration of the sciences and the arts contributed to corrupt or to purify morals? In other words, has the age of reason made us better or worse? When Rousseau heard about this contest, he went for a really long walk in the country just to think about it. And he says that he had this big epiphany when he took a break and sat down under a tree. I'll read it to you because this was an important turning point in Western civilization. If ever I could have written a quarter of what I saw and felt under that tree, with what clarity I should have brought out all the contradictions of our social system. With what simplicity I should have demonstrated that man is by nature good and that only our institutions have made him bad. You see, Rousseau taught that if we really want to fix our worst problems, all we have to do is fix our institutions. Let the state take over everything and use human reason to fix the state. Have everybody get educated by the state and be sure that private property doesn't exist. But I can assure you, from the biblical perspective, owning nothing in this world and letting the state become a replacement for God, well, that's never going to make you happy. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that a free market economy is the ultimate answer either, because it isn't. Personally, I think it's the best solution we've come up with so far, but I also fully recognize there are some problems. And of course, the Bible also widely condemns vices like greed and usury and oppression and slavery. The Scriptures don't mince words when they deal with people who take unfair advantage of others. But again, right now on this side of eternity, this is the best we've got. I mean, it has lifted more people out of poverty than anything else we've ever tried. And I think the reason it works that way is because it's just honest about our human nature. It's a system that openly admits that you and I are self-centered, and it allows us to pursue our selfish interests in a way that theoretically prevents you from violating somebody else's right to do the same thing. It's not perfect, not by a long shot, and it really has led to some pretty awful behavior. But at the end of the day, it's a way of controlling the damage we cause in this world before God finally blows the whistle on all forms of human government and sets up His own. And while we wait for that to happen, God says, "You shall not steal." Not even if you think you have a better idea. Not even if you think that somehow, if you were in control, you could build utopia. You shall not steal. It's God's way of recognizing individual worth. You are not just a meaningless cog in the machine of the state. What you choose to do with your life actually matters, and it's your right to make those decisions. God notices your efforts, and He tells the rest of the planet that what you produce of your own volition, that belongs to you. Now, at the end of the day, everybody still belongs to God, but it's important to recognize that you and I have not been given the job of reappropriating somebody else's efforts or somebody else's possessions. Read the Bible carefully. There are very harsh penalties for stealing or even for moving land markers. Honestly, it's impossible to read the Bible and say that God opposes private property because, well, if He did, the 8th commandment wouldn't mean anything. Even if you think that somebody else is crooked or that somebody else might be getting rich dishonestly, God still says, "You shall not steal." Never forget what Jesus said when His own people asked Him about the oppressive taxes the Romans were charging. "Is it lawful to pay taxes, Lord?" And Jesus took a coin and answered them like this, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then He said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Now, to be perfectly honest, I personally kind of wince when I read that because I think a lot of taxation, not all of it, but a lot of it, is actually a form of stealing. That's my personal opinion. But I also know that God still expects me to pay my taxes. I mean, just go and read Romans 13 and see what you find there. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Not once in human history has a utopian experiment ever worked. And the idea that you and I can somehow fix the human heart by abolishing property? Look, that's been tried, and it has always failed. And that's because the real problem isn't the system, the real problem is us. And I guess that would be my biggest critique of both Rousseau and Karl Marx. I mean, who do you think built all those institutions they were complaining about? Sinful human beings. Which is why those institutions proved to be corrupt. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do better, but it does mean that abolishing the system isn't the answer, because whatever you build next is also going to be constructed by sinners. No matter what people do, God says, "You shall not steal." And if you find things are just a little unfair in this life, if you wish there could be just a little more justice in this world, well, hang on, because God says that's coming. Let me show you what God is planning, and this comes from the description of God's ideal kingdom found in Isaiah 65. They shall build houses and inhabit them, the Bible says. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. It's the ultimate end to stealing. And honestly, I'm ready for it. I mean, I've had my house robbed, I've had my car robbed, and more than once I've seen other people take credit for something I did. I've even been in a church where thieves walked in the middle of the service to steal the collection at gunpoint. And I'm guessing you've been robbed too, and God's not failed to notice. In Proverbs 11, he talks about dishonest merchants and says a false balance is an abomination. And he promises he's going to put an end to it. Not with more hopeless social tinkering that ends up stealing from everybody, but by changing our hearts and launching the kingdom of Christ. It's at that point when you and I will long enjoy the work of our hands. And let's be honest, God actually knows what it feels like to be robbed, because you and I stole the entire planet from Him, and then we started taking credit for things that actually belong to God. And somehow, He's still willing to forgive us. So, maybe it's been a little while since you've read this book. Those Enlightenment philosophers, people have been reading them for hundreds of years, and it's only made everything worse. So now I dare you to read a book with an amazing moral code that has stood the test of time. That's irrefutable. And long after all those atrocious social experiments have collapsed, this book will still be standing. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Shawn Boonstra. This has been another episode of Authentic. Hey, thanks for watching Authentic. Would you be willing to do me a favor? Like, subscribe, and drop a comment. That really does help the algorithm put Authentic in front of more people. And it's free. So go ahead, like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you.